The bride lied she had no family. Her wealthy father arrived a year later. The preacher finished talking, and I remember noticing the top button of my shirt was loose. Kept thinking about it during the whole of the ceremony, that one brass button working its thread, ready to fall, while Nora stood beside me with her hands folded and her eyes forward, and that ring I'd bought off a traveling jeweler sitting on the Bible between us. $7. I'd carried it in my shirt pocket for 2 weeks before she said yes. She said yes the second time I asked. First time she looked at me like she was measuring something, me, the land, the distance from wherever she'd come from. Second time was quiet, a Tuesday. We were standing by the fence line where the creek bends, and she just said, "All right, Calvin," like it was something she'd been working out in her head and had finally come to a conclusion. I didn't know then that she'd been working out more than just me. I want to be honest about what I knew and what I didn't. A man can look back on a thing and arrange it so he comes out seeming smarter than he was, or sadder, or more wronged. I'm not going to do that. I knew she had edges I hadn't found yet. I knew she'd come to town on the eastbound stage with one trunk and a carpet bag and a name, Nora Ellsworth, and a story that was short enough to be suspicious if you were the suspicious type. I wasn't. I was 34 years old and had been alone on that stretch of land since my father died, and I needed a wife the way the land needed rain. Not desperate, not crying about it, just things go better when it comes. I knew she didn't talk about family. I'd asked twice early on while we were still in the courting part of it, going to church, walking the road on Sunday, her sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee that she held in both hands like she was warming herself even in August. I asked if she had people somewhere. She looked at the horizon and said no, not anymore. I took that to mean loss, took it to mean she'd been through something. Didn't ask a third time, because I know what it is to not want to answer a question. My mother died when I was 11. My father worked himself to a gray shadow afterward and checked out at 60 with a bad heart and a cough that went on 6 months too long. I had a brother named Frank who went to Nevada in '79 and wrote one letter and then just stopped. So I understood something about people not being where they used to be. I gave Nora the same room I gave myself on the subject, which was, "It's done, leave it alone, look forward." We were married on a Thursday in early October. Preacher Aldous Willis, who smelled of saddle soap and had hands the size of skillets, said the words. My neighbor Hector Moss stood with me. Nora had the woman from the dry goods, whose name was Ruth, and who Nora had taken to talking to in the 3 months she'd been in town. 30 people maybe in that little church. It smelled like candle wax and whatever oil they put on the pews. After we drove home on the wagon, and neither of us talked much for the first mile. Then she said, "Your roof is uneven on the south side." I said, "I know, I've been meaning to get at it." She said, "I can help with that." I looked at her and she was watching the road, that half smile she had that never quite broke into a full one. And I thought, all right, this is going to be something, whatever it is. The land is in Colfax County, New Mexico Territory. Just under 300 acres of it, though about 60 is canyon cut and not worth much for grazing. I run cattle, used to run more, built it down to about 70 head after a bad winter 2 years before Nora arrived, and I was still building back up. I had 2 horses, a mule, a dog named Patches who had no spots that resembled any patch you'd ever seen. A barn that stood at a slight lean, and a house that was solid enough but plain, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, plank floors, a fireplace in the main room, and a good cast-iron stove that was the finest thing I owned. Nora looked at all of it the first morning as my wife and didn't say much. She walked the perimeter of the yard, looked at the barn, went inside it, came back out. She said, "You need another hand." I said, "Can't afford one." She said, "Then you need to figure out what to stop doing so you can do what matters." I looked at her. She said, "I'm not criticizing. I'm saying the geometry of this place is too much for one person." I said, "I've been one person for a while." She said, "I know," and then she turned and went back in the house, and I heard her moving pots. I stood in the yard a minute with that. We figured it out, the 2 of us, over the next few months. She was not a ranch woman by upbringing. I could see that in small things, the way she held tools a half-beat wrong at first, the way she sometimes paused when she encountered something physical and raw, collecting herself before she went at it. But she was smart, and she was determined, and she had no quit in her. By November, she could mend fence line without being shown. By December, she'd sorted out a better rotation for the pastures than I'd been running, just by watching the grass. She had a particular way of doing things that I noticed and respected. When she didn't know how something worked, she watched until she did, and she didn't pretend otherwise. She'd say, "Show me again," or "I'm going to try that differently than you're doing it, and tell me if I'm wrong." No embarrassment in it, just a practical mind that wanted to get the right answer more than it wanted to look like it already had one. I hadn't met many people who operated that way. Men in particular are bad at it, too much wrapped up in appearing to already know. She just wanted to know. Nights we'd sit by the fire. She'd read, she had books in that trunk more than anything else, and I'd work on whatever needed working on. A harness, a chair leg, one of those practical things that stack up when you run a place alone and never quite get done. We talked, but not in any forced way, about the land, about the cattle, about weather coming in, gradually about other things, her opinions which were pointed. My plans, which she took seriously in a way that nobody else ever had. She asked me once, about 6 weeks in, what I wanted this place to look like in 10 years. Nobody had ever asked me that. Not ever. My father would have thought it was foolishness. You work today, that's all. And every person in that town, in 12 years on that land, not one had sat across from me and asked what I was building toward. I had to think about it. I told her more cattle, obviously. Get the herd back to where it was before the winter loss. Maybe put another room on the house. Thinking about getting into horses some, I said, quarter horses. There's money in good horses. She listened to all of it, nodded. Then she said, so this is a real ranch, not a holding operation. I said it always was, it just got knocked back. She looked at me a beat and said, I believe you. 2 words, I believe you. I don't know that anyone had said that to me about anything that mattered since I was a boy. I kept my face level and went back to the harness strap I was working. But something in me, some tight, old thing, loosened a fraction right there in that firelight. I need to tell you about town, about the way I stood in it, because it matters for what came later. Clayton, New Mexico Territory, was not a mean place. But it had its opinions, and one of its opinions was that Calvin Pruitt was a borderline prospect. I'd been there 12 years. I paid my debts, never caused trouble, helped when asked, minded my business when not. I was not a church-going man, which marked me in some quarters. I had a temper once when I was younger, one fight with a man named Dobbs who cheated me on a feed deal and then lied about it to 3 people, and towns have long memories for a young man's anger even when they forget everything else. The ranch was modest. I didn't dress well. I was not clubbable, as my father used to say, not a man who joins things. So when I brought Nora to town as my wife, there was a version of that reception where people looked at her, and then looked at me, and you could see the arithmetic running behind their eyes. She was handsome in a composed, settled way, nothing flashy, but there was a quality to her that registered, the way she carried herself, the particular way she spoke, like someone who'd been around more than the territory showed. She was 27 to my 34, which wasn't remarkable, but there was something in her bearing that made people uncertain how to place her. Hector Moss asked me, not unkindly, where exactly she'd come from. I said east. She'd been working as a companion for an elderly woman in Raton. He nodded. His wife Dora was warmer about it, took to Nora fairly quick, which mattered since Dora Moss was the kind of woman whose opinion ran downhill through a town fast. The general read, as far as I could gather it, was that Nora Ellsworth had, for some reason, no one could figure out what, chosen Calvin Pruitt. This confused people in the way that unexplained good fortune always confuses people who have decided what category you belong in. They weren't unfriendly. They were just a little baffled. Nora seemed to find this faintly amusing. She told me once, coming home from a Sunday in town, that Mrs. Aldous Willis had asked her in a voice full of charity whether I'd been a good provider. I said, what you tell her. Nora said, I told her you were the most capable man I'd met in the territory, and that I considered myself fortunate. I looked at the road ahead. I said you didn't have to say all that. She said, I know. She paused. I meant it, though. I drove another quarter mile without talking. That loose, old thing in me loosened another fraction. Winter was a partnership. I want to say that plainly because it's the heart of what we were before everything else arrived and complicated it. A hard winter tests what a thing is made of: a fence, a roof, a man, a marriage. Ours came in January with a week of storms that piled snow up to the barn eaves and brought the temperature down so far that the water in the bucket by the door had a skin of ice on it by morning, even with the fire going. Nora didn't panic, didn't complain. She put on every layer she had and came out to the barn with me morning and evening, breaking ice on the water troughs, carrying feed. The cattle came through well. We'd put in good hay stores in the fall, which was her suggestion, more than I'd usually have bought. That's how we kept what we kept. One night about the third week of it, with the wind working at the walls and the fire eating wood faster than I liked, she was sitting close to the hearth mending one of my shirts, and I was at the table with the accounts. I'd been staring at a column of numbers that didn't quite add up to enough. Not disaster, not even close, but tight. Tighter than I liked. I said without looking up that I was thinking about selling the north section come spring. 60 acres. It'd give us room. She didn't answer right away. I heard the needle working. Then she said, "How much do you owe in total?" I told her. She said, "And what's 60 acres worth?" I told her that too, what Hector had gotten for a comparable piece 2 years back. She was quiet a minute. Then she said, "Don't sell it. I have some money. It's yours to use." I looked up from the accounts. She was still working the shirt, not looking at me. I said, "Where'd you get money?" She said, "I saved it, from my years working. It's not a fortune, but it'd carry you through spring without touching the land." I looked at her for a long time. She finally looked back. I said, "Nora, I don't take money from my wife to save my own operation." She said, "It's our operation." I said, 4 months in, we're not going to start counting that way. She set the shirt down. She said, "Calvin, I'm not offering it as charity or as some debt you owe me. I'm offering it because this land is worth keeping whole and because you are worth backing. Because in 4 months I have not seen one single decision you made that was stupid or careless. You're a good steward of this place. I don't want to watch you cut it because of one bad winter." The fire cracked, snow hit the window, the wind ran along the eaves. I said, "How much?" She told me it was enough, more than enough. I said, "I'll pay you back with the calf sales in summer." She picked the shirt back up. She said, "You'll pay me back by not treating it like a charity transaction." I went back to the accounts. After a while I said, "All right." She said, "All right." That was the winter. Spring came and the land came back, and I drove those calves to market in April and came home with enough to clear the operating debt and have money left. I paid Nora back in May, put it on the kitchen table on a Sunday morning. She counted it and then looked at me. She said, "You didn't have to do this yet." I said, "Summer, it's summer enough." She looked at the money and then looked at me and said, "You are a stubborn man." I said, "I'm an honest man. Stubborn's a different category." She almost smiled the full smile, almost. We put money into the horse operation that fall. I found a man in Cimarron who had 3 good mares he'd take fair price on, and I drove down and came back with them, and Nora stood at the fence watching me bring them in, and her face had something on it I hadn't seen before. Not just approval, something fuller than that. She said, "They're beautiful." I said, "Their money is what they are, if I breed them right." She said, "They can be both." I thought about that a while. The horses took work I hadn't fully accounted for. I knew quarter horses, I'd grown up around them some, watched my father trade them, understood the basic lineage questions, but breeding for sale is a different thing than just keeping animals. The difference is reputation. When a man buys a working horse, he is buying a story about where it comes from and what it's done and what it's built to do. I didn't have that story yet. I had 3 mares, a solid bloodline, and the Morgan Cross for cutting work, and I needed to build the story from nothing. I took on a stallion service arrangement with a rancher named Beckett down near Rayado. His stud had the bloodline I needed, and he was willing to work on a foal share basis rather than cash, which was the only way I could swing it. The first foals came in the second spring, and they were good. One was exceptional. I could see it in the way the animal moved at 8 weeks, the set of the shoulder, the lift, and Beckett saw it too and made me an offer I turned down. Nora said, "Why'd you turn it down?" I said, "Because if I sell it, I have one good foal. If I keep it, I have a foundation." She looked at the foal in the paddock. She said, "That's the right call." I said, "It costs us this season." She said, "I know." She said, "Make the right call anyway." That foal, I named him Colfax, which wasn't very original given we were in Colfax County, but it fit him. That horse became the thing I'd been building toward without knowing it. He won 3 out of 4 times the first year I took him to competition over in Trinidad, Colorado, and the 4th time he placed second to an animal from a ranch in Texas that had been doing this for 20 years, And even then the margin was close enough that the man from Texas came and found me after and talked bloodlines for 45 minutes. Word traveled fast. By the end of that second summer, I had a waiting list for stud services and 2 standing purchase offers I was holding in reserve. The horses were the turn in the ranch's fortunes. I won't go through the whole of it, that's its own long story, but I'll say that by the second summer we had 6 horses, and I'd sold 2 at prices that made Hector Moss's eyebrows go up, and word was getting around the county that Prute's animals were something to look at seriously. I was acquiring a reputation for it. People were coming to me, coming to the ranch to look, to talk, sometimes to buy. And something else was happening that I noticed the way you notice, whether coming in from the west, slowly, then all at once. The town's reading of Calvin Prute was quietly shifting. Men who'd spoken to me in the short, flat way you speak to a man you've already filed away started talking to me differently, asking my opinion on things, stopping to jaw a while. The hardware man Burkett started extending my credit without me having to ask. I got invited to sit on a water committee that the county commissioner was putting together. Small things, but they accumulate. Nora watched all of this and didn't say much about it. But once, coming out of the mercantile on a Saturday, a man named Garrett Toll, who owned the biggest spread in the county, stopped us on the walk. He'd never spoken to me in 12 years beyond a nod. He stopped us and shook my hand and said he'd heard about the horses and that he was thinking of coming out to see what I had. After he walked on, Nora tucked her hand into my arm. She wasn't usually one for gestures in public. And she said quietly, so just I could hear, "There you go." I said, "What?" She said, "There you go, Calvin." I looked at her. She was watching the street, that composed face, but her hand was still in my arm and her grip was sure. I said, "You knew this would happen." She said, "I knew you would make it happen. I just waited." A year out from our wedding, October again, the same blonde light, the same smell of the land going dry before the cold. I came in from the barn one afternoon and found a letter on the kitchen table. Nora was standing by the window with her back to me. I said, "What's this?" She didn't turn, she said, "Read it." It was addressed to Nora Ellsworth, care of Prute Ranch, Clayton, Colfax County, NM Territory. The handwriting on the envelope was heavy, angular, the handwriting of a man who signed things often. Inside, one sheet. I read it. The name at the bottom was Edmund G. Ellsworth. The address was Boston, Massachusetts. The letter was not long. It said that he had found her, that he intended to come, that arrangements had been made and he would arrive by the end of the month, that whatever situation she had put herself into he had the means to address it, that she was to write back immediately and advise him of the circumstances she'd found herself in, and he would ensure they were handled properly. He used the phrase, and I remember it exactly because I read it 3 times, he said, "You will be extracted from whatever has befallen you." I set the letter down. I said, "What is Edmund G. Ellsworth to you?" She turned from the window. Her face was careful and sorry and something else, something resolute underneath. She said, "He's my father." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, I could hear one of the horses moving in the barn. I said, "You told me you had no family." She said, "I know." I said, "You told me not anymore. I took that to mean they were dead." She said, "I know what you took it to mean." I stood there with the letter in my hand. 12 years of being a particular kind of careful, honest in my dealings, fair with my word, a man who didn't surprise people, and sitting right here in my kitchen was a year of having been surprised. Not in a small way. I said, "All right, tell me." So she told me. Edmund Ellsworth was a man with money. Not just money, the particular kind of weight that comes when money is several generations old and has grown fingers in railroad, in cattle grazing rights across 4 territories, in banking, in things I wouldn't know the names of. Boston money, which meant it came wrapped in expectations that were stated as though they were nature rather than opinion. He had 1 daughter. Her mother had died when Nora was 14, and after that it was just the 2 of them and the expectations. The man he'd chosen for her, when Nora was 23, was a Boston attorney named Clement Ferris, 41 years old, heavy and settled and prominent, whose morals privately were the kind that don't survive much examination. Nora examined them. When she told her father what she'd found out about Clement Ferris, he told her she was being dramatic. When she told him she wouldn't marry the man, he told her she'd come to see reason. She'd run instead. West because it was the direction with the most distance. She'd spent 2 years moving around, working where she could find work, going by her mother's name, Ellsworth. She'd been in Raton, that part was true, 6 months as a companion to an older woman there. And then she'd come to Clayton because the stage stopped there, and it was raining and the hotel looked warm. She found work. She found Ruth at the dry goods, who was kind. She found a man asking around quietly whether anyone knew of a respectable woman who might consider a working arrangement. That was Hector Moss, asking on my behalf, because I'd told him half in embarrassment that I needed a wife and didn't know how to go about finding one, and Hector, being Hector, had taken it upon himself. She'd looked at me from across the dry goods counter and thought, for reasons she said she was not entirely able to articulate, that I was worth the gamble. But she'd lied about the family. She'd said no because she'd been saying no for 2 years, and she didn't know how to tell the truth about it without telling everything else, and she wasn't sure yet what she'd landed in. She stood in the kitchen and told me this steadily, not flinching from it, not dressing it up. Her hands were at her sides. When she was done, I was quiet a long time. I said, was there anything else that was a lie? She said, no, nothing else. I said, when did you decide to stay, to mean it? She said, that winter, when you didn't sell the land. I said, because I wouldn't sell the land. She said, because of how you wouldn't sell it. Because you sat there with those numbers and the only option you could see was to cut a piece of yourself off and you'd made your peace with it and weren't asking for anything. I thought, that's a man who doesn't lean, not out of pride. She paused, out of being fundamentally intact. I looked at the letter. I said, and now your father's coming. She said, yes. I said, to extract you. She said, that's what he thinks he's going to do. I said, what do you think you're going to do? She looked at me with those level eyes. She said, I think I'm going to need you to be exactly the man you are. He arrived on a Wednesday, 23 days after the letter. I knew the stage schedule, and I had Hector ask around so I'd know which one. I was in town that day on other business anyway, feed supplies. A conversation with the man at the land office about an easement I was sorting out, so I was there when it came in. Edmund Ellsworth stepped off the stage and you could see the money. That's the only way I know to put it. Not flashy, not ornamented, but the quality of the coat, the particular way he held himself, the leather of his luggage. He had a man with him younger that carried things and whose job appeared to be making Edmund Ellsworth's physical life smooth. He was maybe 60, Ellsworth, with a broad jaw and gray at his temples and the eyes of a man who didn't ask questions so much as issue statements. He had 2 other men with him that I didn't understand at first, both armed. Both with a certain professional flatness about them. I watched from across the street. He looked around Clayton with an expression that was careful not to be contemptuous, but was contemptuous anyway. Then he spotted me watching him. I hadn't done much to not be spotted, and he looked at me with those assessing eyes, and I looked back, and neither of us looked away for a moment. Then I went back to the feed store. I told Nora that evening. She was at the stove, and she didn't stop what she was doing when I told her, but her back changed, the set of her shoulders, something bracing. She said, did he see you? I said, we saw each other. She said, good. I said, 2 armed men, Nora. She said, he's had 2 armed men for years. He travels with them in the territories. He thinks everywhere west of the Ohio is the frontier. I said, it is the frontier. She almost smiled. She said, I know. But to him it means lawless and dangerous and beyond the reach of proper behavior, which is convenient because then he can do whatever he wants and call it necessity. I said, what's he going to want to do? She said, come out here, talk at you, make you feel like you're an obstacle, offer you money to step aside. When that doesn't work, he'll try legal angles, question the marriage somehow, question she hesitated, your standing. He has attorneys in every city. He'll construct something. I said, and what do I do? She turned from the stove. She said, you let me handle him. I'm asking you to be present and be yourself. That's all. Don't let him make you feel small. Don't let him manage you. Just stand there and be what you are. I said, I'm not in the habit of feeling small. She said, I know. She said it with something in her voice, not indulgence, not reassurance the way you'd talk to a man who needed bucking up. More like acknowledgement, like she was noting something true. She said, that's exactly why he's going to have a problem. He came out to the ranch on Friday morning, rode out in a hired buggy, driver and all, and his 2 men on horses flanking. I watched them come up the road from the barn door, the same way I watch weather. Nora was in the house. I'd asked her to stay inside until I'd spoken to him first, not because I needed to fight for her or establish dominance or any of that. Just because I wanted to see who he was without her in the room, and I wanted him to see who I was the same way. He got down from the buggy and his man, and his two hands spread out in the yard in that way that's designed to make a man feel hemmed. I noticed it, and I didn't move. I said, "Mr. Ellsworth." He said, "Mr. Prout." He had a voice that expected to be heard clearly. He looked at the ranch, the barn, the house, the fence line, the horses in the pasture. His face ran through several things and settled on something neutral. He said, "My daughter is here." I said, "Your daughter is my wife?" "Yes." He said, "I'd like to speak with her." I said, "She knows you're here. She'll come out when she's ready." He didn't like that. He was a man who ran on his own schedule. He looked at the horses. He said, "Those are good animals." I said, "Yes." He said, "How many acres?" I said, "About 300. He said, "And you've been here 12 years, I understand." I said, "That's right." He said, "Alone until a year ago." I said, "That's right." He was measuring me, assembling a picture. I let him. I had my thumbs in my belt, and I was standing in my own yard on my own land, and I had nowhere to be but right where I was. He said, "What did you know about my daughter before you married her?" I said, "I knew what she told me, same as any man marrying any woman." He said, "She told you she had no family." I said, "She did." He said, "And that didn't concern you." I said, "It concerned me the way any difficult thing in a person's past concerns a man who respects them enough not to push." I said, "She didn't tell me. I didn't push. It was her business to tell or not." He looked at me steadily. He said, "A woman with a lie in her history is not a sound foundation for a marriage." I said, "I'd like you to put the word lie to the side for a minute, Mr. Ellsworth. She didn't tell me about you because she was running from something. I found out what she was running from. I find I don't blame her." His jaw tightened. He said, "You know nothing about the arrangement she refused. It was a good match, a man of standing. She was being dramatic and willful, and she ran halfway across the country out of an irrational." I said, "Clement Ferris." That stopped him. I said, "She told me the name, and what she told me about what she found out about him. I believe her." He said there was no evidence of. I said, "She was there. I'm taking her word." He looked at me a long moment. Then he said, "Mr. Prout, I'm going to speak plainly. You're a man of modest means in a modest situation. I have the resources to make your circumstances considerably more comfortable or considerably more complicated. I don't say that as a threat. I say it as an honest accounting of where we stand." I said, "I appreciate the plain speaking." He said, "Name a figure." I said, "I don't have one." He said, "Every man has one." I said, "I don't, and he'll have a long ride back if he keeps thinking I do." He measured me again. He said, "You'd hold a woman in a marriage she was deceived into." I said, "She wasn't deceived. I wasn't deceived. I married her knowing full well there were things she hadn't told me because she's a careful person and she'd been through something hard. That's not deception. That's a person protecting themselves until they know what they've got." He said, "You seem very certain of what you've got." I said, "I'm certain of what I've built. This ranch and the people on it, that's what I'm certain of." The door of the house opened behind me. I heard Nora's boots on the porch steps. I turned to look at her. She was in her everyday clothes. She hadn't dressed up for him, which I thought was exactly right, and her face was the composed, careful face she used when she was managing herself hard inside. She came down to stand beside me, not behind me, beside. She said, "Father." He said, "Nora." He said it the way men like him say the names of things they own, not unkindly, but with a certainty of possession. He said, "Come here, let me look at you." She stood where she was. She said, "I can see you fine from here." Something moved in his face. He said, "You've been out here a year. You've had your adventure. I'm not here to scold. I'm here because you're my daughter and this." He gestured at the yard. He said, "This is not where you belong." She said, "You don't get to decide where I belong." He said, "You lied about this man's standing. You entered this marriage under representations that were not true. It can be undone. I have an attorney from Santa Fe who will be here Monday. The grounds are there. I will compensate Mr. Prout. She said, "Stop." He stopped. She'd said it quietly, but with a weight that reached him. She said, "I'm going to say some things, and I want you to hear them properly." She said, "I lied about having family because I was running from what you wanted me to do, and I didn't know how to explain the whole of it to a man I just met. That was my choice to make, not yours. The lie was mine to account for, and I've accounted for it with the person it affected." She said, "I chose this man, not because I had nowhere else to go, I had places. Not because I was deceived. I came in with my eyes open. I chose him because in 3 months of knowing him, I could see that he was honest and steady and capable and good to me, and in a year of being his wife, I have not once found that to be wrong." She said, "You came out here with 2 men carrying guns and a lawyer from Santa Fe and an offer of money, and you looked around this place with that look you have, like you're calculating the cost of everything and the value of nothing. And you looked at my husband like he's an obstacle to manage." She said, "He is not an obstacle. He's the best man I've found." Her father said, "Nora." She said, "I am not finished." He was quiet. She said, "Clement Ferris, you stood in our house and told me I was being dramatic. You told me a man of his standing couldn't possibly have done the things I told you he'd done. You chose his standing over my word, your own daughter." Her father's face had changed. The assessing, managing quality was still there, but something had shifted underneath it. She said, "I don't hate you for it. I know why you did it. I know how you think. But I needed you to hear me say that before you stand here and tell me this man is not enough for me. Because I will tell you what enough looks like. Enough looks like a man who sat with bad numbers all winter and never once made me feel like a burden. Enough looks like a man who paid back every cent I loaned him the week he had it, because he said he was an honest man, and that's what honest men do. Enough looks like a man who stood in his own yard this morning and looked you in the eye and wouldn't take a price." She put her hand on my arm. I felt it, the sure grip of it, the same as that day on the street when she said, "There you go," and she looked up at me for a moment and then back at her father. She said, "I'm not coming back with you. Not now, not on Monday, not because of any legal construction your attorney builds. I'm not a child. I'm a wife. On a working ranch that is doing better every season because of the man standing beside me." She said, "You can come in for coffee if you want to know us. You can get back in that buggy if you don't. But the answer to what you came for is the same either way." The yard was quiet. One of the horses moved in the pasture. Patches was lying in the sun near the barn, and he lifted his head and looked at the buggy and then put it back down. Edmund Ellsworth looked at his daughter for a long time. Then he looked at me. I looked back at him the same way I had across the street in town, level, without working at it. I had nothing to prove and nowhere to be. This was my land and she was my wife, and that was the sum of the situation. Something in him, some piece of the managing, arranging, calculating apparatus, went quiet. He looked at the horses again. He said, "Quarter horses." I said, "3/4. Got 1 Morgan cross I use for cutting." He said, "What bloodline on the quarters?" I told him. He nodded slowly. He said, "There's money in that." I said, "I know." He looked at Nora. He said, "You're sure?" She said, "I'm sure." He looked down at his hands. He said, "You could have written." She said, "I know, I'm sorry I didn't." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "All right." He didn't say it the way she'd said all right that winter by the fire. He said it the way a man says it when he's lost an argument he'd prepared well for and knows it. He said, "I'll come in for a while." Nora looked at me. I nodded. He stayed 2 days. Not how he'd planned to stay, no lawyer, no papers, no extraction. He slept in the Linta room, which I'd cleared out and put a decent mattress in, and in the mornings he sat at our kitchen table and drank coffee that was stronger than he was used to and watched the way the ranch ran. He was not a warm man. He didn't transform. He didn't weep and take me by the shoulder and call me son. That's not what happened, and I'm not going to make it that. What happened was that over 2 days a man who'd arrived to dismantle something looked at it steadily and revised his accounting. He watched Nora work. I think that was part of it, watching his daughter move through a physical landscape with that competence she'd built, because she'd built it from scratch in a year. She wasn't performing for him. She was just working, and he watched. He looked at the horses for an hour Saturday morning, walking the fence line by himself, and when he came back he had questions that were real questions, not condescension. I answered them straight. We talked about the breeding program, about what I was planning for the following year. His family had holdings in Texas cattle country at some point, his father's generation. He knew more about the land trade than I'd expected. He asked to see Colfax work. I had the boy from town who helped me on weekends, a 14-year-old named Ruddy who was fearless on a horse and could feel an animal the way some people can hear music. And I had Ruddy take Colfax through his paces in the paddock while we stood at the fence. The horse moved the way good horses move when they know they're doing their job right. Deliberate, collected, something that looks like pride but is just bone-deep good breeding coming through. Ellsworth watched Colfax for a long time. Then he said, "That animal will make you real money." I said, "Already has some." He said, "I mean real money, not territory money." I looked at him, he looked back. He wasn't trying to diminish it. He was making an accurate statement from a different scale of reference. I said, "I know." He said, "Have you thought about expanding the bloodline? There are operations in Texas and Kentucky that would pay well for stud access to a horse like that." I said, "I've thought about it. It's a question of getting in front of the right people." He was quiet a moment. Then, casually, like it didn't matter much either way, he said, "I know people in both places." I looked at him. He looked at the horse. I said, "I'll keep that in mind." He nodded. Saturday afternoon, he asked me to walk with him out to the north section. I took him out there, the 60 acres I'd almost sold that winter, and we stood on the high part of it where you can see down the canyon. He said, "You almost sold this." I said, "Last winter, it would have been the practical move." He said, "Why didn't you?" I said, "Nora talked me out of it." He was quiet a while. He said, "She has her mother's instincts. Her mother could see what a thing was worth." I said, "I know she comes from somewhere, Mr. Ellsworth. I never doubted that." He looked at me. He said, "I don't think I did you justice." I said, "I don't need justice from you. I need you to be square with your daughter." He said, "That's a frank thing to say to a man." I said, "You came out here to manage me. I think frank's appropriate." He had something that was almost the expression of a man who's been surprised pleasantly. He looked down the canyon. He said, she needs to know I'll still." He stopped. He said, "I did a bad thing when I didn't believe her about Ferris." I said, "That's between you and her." He said, "Yes." He said it with the weight of a man who's been carrying something. He said, "You'll let her write to me. You'll let her," he looked at the canyon, "you'll let her keep me in her life, even if I." I said, "Mr. Ellsworth, she's my wife, not my property. She doesn't need my permission to write her father. She never needed my permission for anything." He nodded. We stood there a while. The canyon was blonde and gold in the October light, the same light as the day I'd been married, and the land went down and out as far as I could see. He said, "It's a good piece of land." I said, "Yes." He said, "You'll take care of it." I said, "That's what I do." There was something in him that settled then. I could feel it, standing beside him at the edge of that canyon, some decision he'd arrived at. He'd come out here with an extraction plan and 2 hired guns and a Santa Fe lawyer, and he'd gotten to the end of the road with all 3 of them and found the road kept going without him. I don't think he was a bad man. I think he was a man who'd spent his life being able to buy his way through complications, and Nora had always been the one thing he couldn't buy through, and now she was on a New Mexico canyon rim watching her husband not be managed, and something in the ledger finally came out different. He left Sunday morning before the light got high, his 2 men and his hired buggy. He shook my hand at the wagon, which was the first time he'd done it, and the grip was real. He looked at Nora for a long moment, and she went to him, and he put his arms around her, and I turned and went into the barn because some things deserve their privacy. When the buggy was down the road and gone, Nora came into the barn. I was at the Morgan Cross's stall, checking a hoof he'd been favoring. She came and leaned on the stall door and watched me work. She said, "Thank you." I said, "I didn't do much." She said, "You stood there. That was everything." I said, "That's not much." She said, "To him it was." She said, "Calvin, to me it's everything." I set the hoof down and straightened and looked at her. She was watching me with those level eyes that had measured things since the first time she looked across a dry goods counter. Only now there was nothing being measured. The calculation was done. Had been done, I thought, since a winter night by a fire when she'd offered money she didn't have to spare and I'd been too proud to take it easy. She stepped around the stall door and came to me. She put both hands flat on my chest, just that, just resting there, and looked up at me with a trust that was total and unself-conscious. She said I meant every word I said to him. I said I know. She said, in case you didn't hear it, the best part. I said I heard. She said, say it. I said, you said I was the best man you'd found. She said, yes. She said, do you believe me? I looked at her. I thought about 12 years on a piece of land that people had already decided was modest. 12 winters, a brother who stopped writing. A town that filed you and didn't look again. I thought about a woman who'd arrived on a stage in the rain and looked at me with measuring eyes, and then, months later, those same eyes no longer measuring anything. I said, I believe you. She pressed her forehead against my jaw. I put my arms around her and she stayed there. The Morgan shifted and exhaled. Outside, the land sat in its blonde October light, whole and uncut, and going on toward the horizon for as far as anyone could need. After a while she said, he'll write. He's not built for not being in contact. I said, that's fine. She said he might come again, next summer maybe. I said, he's welcome, if he leaves the armed men in Boston. She laughed, the real laugh, not the near smile. I'd heard it a handful of times in a year, and each time it was like finding something. She pulled back and looked up at me, and the laugh was still on her face. She said, I'll see what I can do. I finished that year in November, closing out the accounts at the kitchen table with Nora across from me with her books. The numbers were the best they'd been in my time on that land. The horses doing what I'd thought they'd do, the cattle herd back to a real number, the operating costs clean. I sat back and looked at what it added up to. She said, well. I said, it's good. She said, how good? I told her. She set the book down. She said, that's better than you expected. I said, by some. She said, next year will be better still. I said, probably. She looked at me across the table. I looked at her. The fire was going and the lamp was lit and the wind was outside doing what wind does in November. I think about that moment sometimes, when things get complicated or the land gives trouble the way land does. I think about the kitchen and the lamplight and the accounts that finally added up right, and the woman across the table who'd looked at me once across a dry goods counter and decided I was worth the gamble. A lot of men never get that. Never have a person look at the whole of them, the modest spread, the modest town, the 12 years alone, the quick temper they'd mostly grown out of, and say, yes, that one, him. I had it, I knew it, sitting there. I said, you warm enough? She said, I'm fine. I said, fire needs another log in about an hour. She said, I know, Calvin, I live here. I went back to the accounts. She went back to her book. The wind moved along the eaves and the fire cracked in patches was stretched by the hearth, twitching in whatever dream a dog has. That's where we were, that's what we'd made. That button, the one I'd been thinking about during the wedding, I found it in the pocket of that same shirt about 6 months after. Must have come off in the wash and she'd saved it. I found it one morning getting ready, turned the pocket inside out by accident, and there it was. She'd already sewn a better one on the collar, so it was just sitting there in the pocket, carried around by accident. I kept it. I don't know exactly why. A man keeps what matters to him in ways he can't always explain. I still have it. Ellsworth wrote in December like she'd said he would. I came in from the barn on a cold morning and there was a letter on the table and Nora was reading it by the window, that same posture she'd had the first time, back to me but different. Her shoulders weren't braced. She was just reading. She handed it to me when she heard me come in. He'd written to her about his health, some trouble with a knee, apparently, about Boston, about a business matter in Texas he was working through, and at the end, 2 paragraphs. He said he'd given some thought to their conversation and that he had spoken since returning to certain people who knew Clement Ferris, and that he used the word regretted, which I imagine cost him considerable. He regretted that he had not listened more carefully when she first came to him. He said he had taken steps. He did not say what steps. I thought about what a man with his resources could do to another man's reputation and career in a city like Boston, and I decided I didn't need to know the specifics. He also wrote, near the end, that he had mentioned my horse operation to a man named Rutherford who ran a significant cattle and horse concern in central Texas, and that Rutherford had expressed interest in a conversation. Nora watched me read the whole thing. When I set it down, she said, "Well, I said he did what he said he'd do, both things." She said, "Yes." I said, "You going to write back?" She looked out the window a while. She said, "Yes." She said, "I know what he is. But he's also my father, and he came when he thought I needed help, even if he was wrong about what kind." I said, "That's generous." She said, "It's accurate." She said, "Generosity and accuracy aren't always different things." I thought about that. Then I said, "You want me to leave you alone to write?" She looked at me and said, "No, stay. I'd rather you be here." So I was there. I sat at the other end of the table with the harness I'd been oiling, and she wrote her father a letter. And every few minutes she'd look up and say something, the shape of a sentence she was working on, a question about what I thought she should include or leave out. I gave her my read when she asked and stayed quiet when she didn't. The lamp burned down some, and outside the wind was low and cold, and inside it was warm enough. She finished and folded it and addressed it and set it on the table. She said, "That's probably the hardest letter I've ever written." I said, "You seemed steady." She said, "I was, because you were here." I looked at the harness and didn't say anything, but I heard it. The letter from Rutherford in Texas came in February. It was everything Ellsworth had implied. A serious operation, serious money, serious interest in what I had. We exchanged 3 letters over the spring, and then in June a man came up from Texas on behalf of Rutherford, a quiet man named Albie who knew horses the way a doctor knows bodies, and he spent 2 days on the ranch looking at the operation. He watched Colfax work for most of one afternoon, and he wrote things down in a small notebook and didn't say much while he was doing it. That evening he sat at our kitchen table, and Nora served coffee, and he laid out what Rutherford was interested in: a breeding arrangement, multi-year, Colfax and 2 of the mares, fair compensation, 1 foal in 3 staying with us. It was more money than I'd made in the previous 3 years combined. I said I needed a week to think on it. Albie said, "That's reasonable." He said, "Mr. Rutherford said to tell you he was told you were a man who makes good decisions and doesn't rush them." I looked at the man. He said, "I believe those were the words used, yes." Nora refilled his coffee and kept her face composed. After Albie left, she turned to me and said, "Your father-in-law is a piece of work." I said, "He is." She said, "Is that a bad thing?" I said, "Not entirely." She said, "The offer." I said, "It's real, it's good. It changes the scale of what this is." She said, "I know." I said, "I'm going to say yes." She said, "I know that too." She said, "I've known it since you read the letter. You got that look you get when you've already decided, but you're going to make sure you're deciding right." I said, "What look is that?" She thought about it. She said, "Like the land when it goes quiet before rain." I sat with that a minute. I said, "That's a strange way to describe a man's face." She said, "That's what it looks like." I took the Rutherford deal. 6 months later, the money from the first installment came, and I put 1/3 of it back into the operation, and 1/3 into an expansion of the barn, which we needed badly, and 1/3 into a savings account at the Clayton Bank, which I'd never had before. I told the banker, a man named Fogarty who'd always been perfectly polite to me in the way men are polite to someone they've already placed lower than themselves. I told him I'd be back quarterly. He said, "Of course, Mr. Prout." His manner was different, not warm exactly, but different. I drove home in the good late afternoon light, and Nora was mending something on the porch when I pulled up, and she looked up when I got down from the wagon. She said, "How'd it go?" I said, "Fine." She said, "How fine?" I told her the number, the quarterly amount. She set the mending down in her lap. She looked at the road, and then she looked back at me. She said, "Fogarty." I said, "Yes." She said, "What was his face like?" I said, "Attentive." She said, "Good." She picked the mending back up. I unsaddled the horse and turned him out, and when I came back to the house, she had supper going, and the lamp was lit, and the evening was coming in soft and golden across the land. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and watched her at the stove. She didn't know I was there yet, or she was giving me the moment. With Nora, it was sometimes hard to tell. The kitchen was warm and smelled of good things, and outside the land was doing what it does in the last of a summer evening, going amber and long-shadowed and still. I thought 12 years I had this land, and it was good land, and I knew it was good land, and nobody agreed with me. And then a woman arrived on a stage in the rain and looked at me from across a counter, and something in her, whatever she was running from, whatever she was calculating, something said yes. And now the land is what I always knew it was, and she's at that stove, and it's warm. She turned and saw me and said, "How long have you been standing there?" I said, "A minute." She said, "Supper's not ready." I said, "I know, I'm not in a hurry." She looked at me, and the near smile was there, and something behind it that was more than that, affection or recognition, one of those things that doesn't have a clean name. She turned back to the stove. I sat down at the table. She said, "Your father-in-law is going to want a report." I said, "Then he'll get one." She said, "Are you going to be polite about it, or are you going to be insufferable?" I said, "I'm going to be accurate." She laughed, the real one. I sat at the table in the warm kitchen on my own land, and I heard her laugh, and outside the evening was going gold, and the land was whole, and I was exactly what I was. A man who built a thing, and had someone to build it with, and had been seen clearly by a person whose eyes were worth something. That's all I'm going to say about it. Some things don't need a summing up. They need a quiet room and a good woman at the stove, and the knowledge that what you have is real and earned and yours. The rest is just living. And I've been doing that. There's one more thing I want to say, and then I'm done. Hector Moss came out the following spring with a bottle of good whiskey and sat on my porch and said, "Calvin, I'm going to be honest with you. When I asked around on your behalf about a woman, when I was doing what Nora found me doing, inquiring whether anyone knew of a respectable woman who might consider a working situation, I was not expecting much to come of it." He said this plainly and without apology, which is why I liked Hector. He said, "I thought maybe you'd find a widow with children who needed a roof, someone practical, someone who'd work hard and not make demands." I said, "That's a grim way to think about a man's prospects." He said, "I know, I'm sorry for it, but you have to understand what the town thought you were." I said, "I know what the town thought I was." He said, "Do you know what it thinks now?" I said, "I have some idea." He said, "Let me tell you the whole of it." He poured the whiskey. He said, "Garrett told me last month that you were one of the best operators in the county, not the biggest, but the best, the soundest. He said you made decisions the way a man who's been at it 40 years makes decisions, and he's 58 and been at it 40 years. I looked at the land from the porch. Hector said, "I'm not telling you this to flatter you. I'm telling you because I want you to know that what you built out here is visible. People see it. Men who didn't see you before see you now." And he paused, and I think that woman in your house had more to do with it than you'll probably say out loud. I said she had everything to do with it. He looked at me. I said not because she changed what I was, because she saw what I was before it was visible to anyone else, and she said so plainly, and she stayed, and she worked, and she never once looked around at what we had and found it lacking. When someone does that, when someone commits to a thing the way she committed to this, you work differently. You think bigger. You don't spend energy defending yourself against your own doubts, because someone who's smart and careful has already looked at you and called it good. Hector was quiet a while. Then he said, "Dora said something like that once. When I was struggling with the Miller Creek parcel, she said, 'Hector, it's good land and you're a good man and you're going to figure this out.'" He looked at his glass. I didn't tell her it mattered as much as it did. I said, "You might consider doing that." He said, "Maybe I will." We sat on the porch a while with the whiskey and the evening coming on, and the land lay out before us in the late light, and the horses moved in the far pasture. And behind me through the open door I could hear Nora inside, moving, living, being exactly where she'd chosen to be. That's the sum of it, that's what I know. A man builds. If he's lucky, one day someone arrives who sees the building for what it is, who looks at the whole thing, the years and the work and the hard decisions and the places where he held firm, and says, "Yes, I'll take my place in this. I choose this. I choose you." That's the whole story.